So in 2023, I ran my first 100-mile ultramarathon, which was the South Downs Way 100 by Centurion Running. And after I'd finished it, it got me thinking about the history of 100-milers. What were the first ones like here in the UK? I did a bit of research and I found that the first mass participation 100-miler was the Downsman 100, organised by the Long Distance Walkers Association in 1973. And it actually followed pretty much the same route of the race that I'd done 50 years later. So in this video, I want you to think a little bit about the differences, what's changed in 100-milers in that space of 50 years. And we're also going to hear from a couple of people who ran the Downsman 100 in 1973 themselves, so we can hear about their experience and also maybe think about some of the things that were different back then. So just a disclaimer, firstly, we might not necessarily be comparing like for like when we look at these two events. The Downsman 100 was set up by the LDWA, the Long Distance Walkers Association, founded in 1972. And this is largely a walkers and hikers group that organise non-competitive events. And yes, people are given times based on how quickly they walk or hike, and some do indeed run, but it's not seen as a ranking and there are no prizes for the sharp end of the field, whereas the South Downs Way 100, it is set up as a race, so it's very much a competitive event. And the fact that the LDWA 100-milers are mainly for walkers and hikers is reflected in the cut-off time of 48 hours, which there was for the Downsman 100 in 1973, and there has been in all subsequent 100-milers organised by the Long Distance Walkers Association. Whereas for the South Downs Way 100, which is mainly for runners, the cut-off there is 30 hours. The DNF, or did not finish rate, between the two events is not too dissimilar, but it is worth saying that this was the highest DNF rate that the South Downs Way 100 had, and that was largely due to people suffering ill effects of the heat. In fact, once the sun had set, then the DNF rate pretty much dropped off completely. And we can also see a difference in the participation rate of women between these two events. So at the Downsman 100 it was 5%, at the South Downs Way 100 it was around 17%, which is not the highest participation rate for women a Centurion event has had, and indeed not as high as some other ultras out there where it's been roughly 50-50. David Rosen, the first male finisher we're going to hear from later on, so he ran a time of 22:20, and he was actually there with his brother Alan, who was 18 at the time and the youngest finisher on the day. So in the race report for the Downsman 100, we're not only given statistics that relate to the event, but there is also a section of it called Competitors Snippets, where they say a little bit about the people, at least some of the people who were taking part. And we're told that 3 sets of brothers finished the event. One of those sets was David and Alan, who I mentioned a moment ago. And we're also told that Stanley Jewell, who was the postman for Chorley at the time, aged 33, walked the whole distance in his postman's uniform. So although I couldn't find a picture of Stanley himself, this is a 1970s postman's uniform. So essentially he completed the 100 miles in this. So in a moment we'll hear from David Rosen and Matt Clark, who both finished the Downsman 100 in 1973. I started off by asking them what their background of running and walking was prior to the event, and also what made them sign up.
Hello, I'm David Rosen. I was born in June 1953, so I was 19 years old at the time of the first Downsman 100. I was then in my first year at Oxford University studying mathematics. And while at Oxford, I met Miriam, my wife, through orienteering. From the age of about 8, I'd enjoyed running. I ran with my father a little bit, and then I ran cross country at school. I was never a fast runner, so I was often last in training and in races. I did a few charity walks at school and did them as fast as I could. And in early 1969, I went to an orienteering event, and that remains the main sport for me and my wife to this day. Alan Blatchford encouraged me and my younger brother to enter the first Downsman 100. Yeah, although I'd never done anything remotely as far before, I was fairly relaxed. Many of the participants knew each other, so it was all very friendly. Uh, we were we'd done a lot of long distance walks, 20 or 30 milers before, and it was just going to be very much the same, we thought, but going on for rather longer.
Okay, well, yeah, my name's Matt Clark. I don't think I used the name Matt back in 1973, but I can't probably just Matthew then. Anyway, I mean, bear in mind it was 50 years ago, 51 years ago. But what I do remember was that a friend, said to me, "Oh, they'd read it in something like the Daily Mirror. It was advertised. This event was advertised, and she said to me, "Oh, that you might be interested in that." So me and a mate of mine looked at it and we applied, and that's how I got to be there. I mean, I wasn't doing anything like that then. I mean, I was going into the hills and that sort of thing. But yeah, it just appealed to me. Not a lot has changed with the atmosphere of the 100. I mean, yeah, we were all eagerly anticipating setting off. The weather was, as I remember, was glorious. And the mayor came along. I'm pretty certain the mayor came to say something, but I mean, it was obviously quite low key, and I think from the results there was about 150 of us. Well, the LDWA 100 is just very different. I mean, yeah, most of the people aren't athletes as such, but they're just capable of walking very long distances. And I mean, you know, when I think about the ones that I've done, we'd be usually a group of 4 or 5 of us, and you know, we'd be talking for a lot of the time, just chatting away, you know, to keep us going, albeit nonsense, but
So there really aren't very many photos at all of the Downsman 100 in its first edition in 1973, but I did manage to find this image in Strider magazine, which is published by the LDWA, and it shows the start line of the event. What I think is amazing is what people are wearing. It's so different from what you would see on the start lines of 100s like the South Downs Way 100 nowadays. And that's what I asked Matt and David about next. You know, what were they wearing and what was the clothing like of the people during the event at the Downsman?
Well, I think it depended on whether they were essentially walking or running, but I wore my studded orienteering shoes on my feet and probably a nylon orienteering top and shorts, maybe with a lightweight cagoule or something in the bum bag.
I would have been wearing, probably, I'm pretty certain, a pair of breeches. So I mean, you don't see them now, but back then, to go into the hills, everybody wore kind of moleskin breeches. So you had long socks and these breeches. I mean, the one thing I definitely remember is that I was wearing a pair of Scarpa Monte Rosa boots. And these were mountaineering boots, you know, they weren't kind of lightweight walking boots. And I think most people were wearing boots at the time. I'd have had some cheap waterproof. The other thing I do remember is I had a Helly Hansen double ventile anorak, which was quite, I used to really like that, and it did keep the wind off. But I don't remember carrying a huge amount of gear. And the other thing was, I mean, there was no Gore-Tex and stuff like that. And certainly for me, at the age of 21, I mean, I didn't really have any money. So, you know, the gear was not up to much.
It's interesting because when I did the South Downs Way last year, for the 100, there was a big list of mandatory kit, which is quite common now, that, you know, you have to carry, you have to have a certain amount of water carrying capacity. You have to have like a waterproof jacket with taped seams, a spare base layer, spare nutrition, a whistle. So a number of things. Was there any mandatory kit for the Downsman in 1973?
Not that I can remember. I mean, having done hundreds since then, you know, in the 80s and 90s, well, and in the 2000s, you know, they have spot kit checks and everything. But that no, I that didn't exist. I mean, I'm pretty certain they'd have recommended something. And I mean, we didn't have, the other thing we didn't have was sort of head torches either. You know, I think we just had a handheld torch.
Nutrition, it's such a big thing that people talk about for ultramarathons nowadays. People have electrolyte drinks, they have energy drinks, they have tablets and chews and various concoctions and cocktails of things. So that's what I asked David and Matt about next. What was their nutrition for the day? What were they eating? What were they drinking?
Well, I don't think I actually took very much with me. I think I just relied on what we were given at the checkpoints. So it was a bit random according to what the checkpoint officials decided to make the night before, whether it was flapjack or rice pudding or some sort of quiche or whatever. So it was always a surprise when you got to each checkpoint, generally a nice surprise.
I mean, very little has changed in some ways with the LDWA 100 in terms of checkpoints and food. I mean, there was plenty of sandwiches, a lot of tin fruit and rice pudding, that still exists. And I mean, we didn't really talk about nutrition. All we talked about was food. And you know, I probably weighed about 11 stone at the time. And I paid me money and I just ate whatever was put in front of me. But I mean, one particular memory was about 30 miles in, we got to the top of a hill and there was a checkpoint and there was a chap literally frying up sausages on a primus stove. Because again, there wasn't like posh gas camping stoves. I mean, this was a primus with probably, you know, petrol or paraffin using it. And my mate said to me, how on the earth can you eat that? As I scoffed down two of these hot dogs. I mean, we just, you know, just ate what I could. Yeah. Oh yeah, a tremendous amount of cups of tea and juice and stuff. Yeah. I mean, there weren't any electrolyte drinks or anything, you know, like that. And I guess, you know, we would have been carrying water.
Ultramarathons typically have good points, bad points, highs and lows. So I asked David and Matt next to share what some of those were for them.
Well, I had a plan, which was to walk the uphills and jog the downhills and the flat. And that worked very well. I was used to following LDWA route descriptions, and the chalky path of the South Downs Way is quite easy to follow at night. I only got into the lead at halfway and then just kept going, eventually finishing in 22 hours, 20 minutes. That was 70 minutes ahead of Pete Dawes, who himself was an hour ahead of Ted Norrish. I actually knew Ted because Ted was the master in charge of cross country at Henry VIII School, Coventry. He also took his pupils orienteering and kindly included me on some of his trips. And Ted found me a partner for my first mountain marathon, the Carrymore in 1971 in Snowdonia.
That's a difficult one. I mean, for me, I'd never been to that part of the world before. I mean, I was born and brought up in the Swansea Valley in South Wales. And then when I left home, I moved up to North Wales. So that was quite an eye-opener, the properties and things like that we passed by. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that. And from memory, the chap I went with, he retired at about 60 miles, so we must have gone through, the night together. And I can't remember any real low points. What I do remember is it would have been just beyond Ditchling Beacon, and I just after a checkpoint, I lay down and nodded off for probably, I don't know, 15-20 minutes, and then about 4 or 5 guys came along, and I thought I think they either woke me up or I was waking up, and they asked me if I was all right. I said I'm fine, and they said, "Oh, come along with us." And I thought they were ancient. They were probably about 35 or 40, and I stayed with them then till the end. So I don't know, maybe we had another 30 miles to go. And when I looked at the results, I can see there were about 5 or 6 of us all came in at the same time. And we would have been it would have just been into the second night. It was just before midnight that we got in. But another highlight, I think, going through the night was seeing the lights of Brighton. It was probably mainly Brighton, but you could see the coast, the lights on the coast. And it was just surreal, really. That's the other thing that was the finish was, from memory, was in some sort of school, and we had a meal. I don't know, but the usual thing, it was some sort of stew or casserole, and we just crashed out on the floor in the room where everybody was eating.
So for both David and Matt, the Downsman 100 in 1973 was their first venture into the 100-mile distance. So I was interested to know, where did they go from here? What running or walking did they do following the event?
Well, at 19 years of age, I was actually at that point too young to run marathons, so I was quite looking forward to becoming 21. I continued doing LDWA 100s for many years until 1991, and my fastest was the 1980 Downsman, which I ran with Keith Arnold, and we took 16 hours and 13 minutes. I also completed the 1982 Pilgrims 100 Plus, which was 142 miles. It went all the way on to Canterbury. And I was second finisher there in 29 hours and 53 minutes, 48 minutes behind Keith Arnold. Alan Blatchford also encouraged me to enter the London to Brighton road race, which is about 53 miles. I ran it every year from 1975 to 1996, with the best position of 8th in 1988. I've run a number of 100k road races and very many marathons, with the best time of 2 hours 34 in the 1988 London Marathon. I actually prefer running on softer terrain, and I've also run many fell races, preferring the longer navigational type ones. I've completed 33 Lake District mountain trials and many 2-day mountain marathons. As I said, my main sport is actually orienteering, and I was a member of the British orienteering team in the late 1970s. Miriam, my wife, and I continue orienteering all over the world to this day. And I'm chair of the Rules Commission of the International Orienteering Federation.
I went the following year, which was the Peak District, but we retired about 60 miles. And then I had a gap because, I was only in my early 20s, and there were other things to be interested in. And then I met my wife in 76, whose parents actually lived in Hassocks, which is not far from Ditchling Beacon. Anyway, so then in the early 80s, I got going again, and I retired on one Downsman, but then I did a couple, I finished a couple, and then there were other more local ones to where I live in mid Wales now. So between then and about 2012, I think, I finished 10 and then retired on 9, and then just got to a stage where I knew I couldn't really do it anymore. But I've done lots of 100k events and 50-mile events, and the usual LDWA 25 milers. So I kept going, doing all of those.
So finally, I asked David and Matt if they had any tips for people who were thinking of doing 100 milers.
I'd just say take it slowly to begin with, and you can always speed up over the second half if you're feeling good.
Well, I mean, you do need to get some mileage in training, and I mean the other thing is if you are feeling, if you're having a low point, don't do anything rash at a checkpoint in terms of retiring. Just sit for 15 or 20 minutes and wait, and then make your decision, because you can regret it. But I mean, it's the fastest time I ever did 100 in 35 hours and 40 minutes. I never did one at that quick. So we must have been, moving at a reasonable pace, because since then, I mean, I've taken over 47 hours on some of them, just getting in, spending 2 nights out, which for anybody who's not done one, it's not as bad as it sounds. Going into a second night, you just get on with it, I suppose. Around dawn, there's something in your brain kicks in, and wakes you up. So yes, you might have been struggling a bit and wanting to nod off, but then once dawn comes, you start you liven up again. And I mean, the other thing is, don't be afraid to take a 20-minute nap.
As much as 100 milers have changed over the years when it comes to things like clothing and nutrition, there are some themes that remain the same. The distance is a chance to push yourself and to see what your mind and body are capable of. A chance for adventure, for challenge, and for most of us, a night out on the trails. And for me, on the start line of the South Downs Way 100 on that morning in Winchester, it was just like it was for many 50 years earlier. Taking a step into the unknown. So big thanks firstly to David and Matt for sharing their experiences of the Downsman 100. And I also wanted to thank Keith Warman from the LDWA, who's the 100 miler archivist. He essentially collects all of the data for all 100 milers, and he was really helpful at getting me in contact with David and Matt, but also in providing lots of stats and information about the Downsman 100 itself. Also a shout out to Davy Crockett, who is an ultramarathon historian, and I used a lot of information from his website for this particular video. So I'll pop the link to that below in case you're interested in looking at ultra history generally. And thanks very much for watching. If you've got any ideas, any comments on the content of today's video, then just pop them below. And yeah, thanks very much for watching.